Well, greetings, classmates. Um, Now that our reunion has come and gone a few weeks ago, even faster than our 4 years together half a century ago, I've put a lot of it online for you to see. It was a wonderful reunion. We had a grand attendance, and the weather was perfect, and those of you who were there, I know, enjoyed it, and those of you who weren't really missed a wonderful opportunity to visit with old friends and to see how they're doing. Um, I've put everything online, and you'll be able to see that on a website, including this show, of course. And as far as this show goes, you can look at it and see it again if you were there and reflect at your own pace when you can pause it on your computer. And if you weren't there, of course, there's an opportunity to get a little bit of the color and feeling of the reunion and the various presentations that I prepared for all of us. Well, here's one before we even get going, that you might really want to pause on for This Is Us. Actually, shouldn't that be This Is We? Isn't that a predicate nominative? I don't know. It sounds much better. This Is Us. Anyway, here we all are. And you should be able to recognize many, if not most, of the faces if you've been coming over the years. I think we look pretty damn good for a bunch of semi-codgers attending a 50th college reunion. I count about 78 in this picture, and the total attendance, I think I was told, was closer to 90. It was a beautiful, perfect weekend in so many ways, but I'm sure that none of us got enough time to have as meaningful conversations as we had hoped with old friends. I know I didn't, but here we are. I'm sure you've gotten this picture now from Brandeis. So let's just get on with this show. The year was 1962, and it certainly was a very important and fateful one for all of us. JFK and Jackie seemed the perfect couple living in the White House, bringing vigor, style, and intellectual sophistication to politics and new hope to a stagnant, Cold War embittered world. The wall was already up across Eastern Europe, and for sport and in competing efforts for world domination, the U.S. and the Soviet Union were building and testing very, very big bombs. Lots of them. They'd even perfected placing them on top of deadly accurate intercontinental ballistic missiles. Remember those? Indeed, the world was literally days from a little nuclear kerfuffle over a few of those ICBMs that were now vacationing on the sunny island of Cuba, just 90 miles from Miami, which were aimed at most of our hometowns. Sometimes it's good to be able to forget things so easily. In 1962, my favorite pope ever, Pope John XXIII, embodying the new spirit of reform in the Church, opened the glorious Vatican II Council, which was to bring many great progressive changes to the Church, including to its view about the Jews. It was the last great era when one could be openly proud to be a secular humanist and, God forbid, even worse, a liberal. In Algeria, after 132 years of colonization, during 114 of which it was considered an integral, if slightly different and inferior part of France, and then a very bloody 8-year civil war in which the French realized that perhaps it shouldn't be. Um, the army of a great civilized nation became almost as brutal as the terrorist nationalists they were opposing. Finally, exasperated and exhausted after so much conflict and bloodshed, Charles de Gaulle granted independence to Algeria, unwittingly beginning the Islamic transformation of formerly docile and cooperative Muslim nations. In the world of Cold War analogs, young Bobby Fischer was the king of chess and was soon to conquer the Soviets, but he was only a future king of psychotic anti-Semitism. At the time, that title still belonged to Adolf Eichmann, who, after spending 12 years on the lam, living with the new name Ricardo Clement in a suburb of Buenos Aires, was captured by the Mossad on May 11, 1960, and brought to Israel. In May of 1962, he got his long overdue reward after a very extended show trial broadcast worldwide, and then at the end of a relatively short rope. In 1962, first-class letter postage was still 4 cents, imagine, and politicians look like this. In those days, they generally respected, negotiated with, and expected to compromise with each other. They even socialized regularly with and genuinely liked their political opponents. More amazing, they actually appeared relatively sane. The word moderate was not yet a pejorative and was frequently applied to most Republicans. The sobriquet liberal was a proud moniker to people in both parties. In 1962, cars looked like this. These cars were lucky to make it to 5 years and 60,000 miles. Today, that is totally lame. In 1962, my mom had a zippy but oversized black Thunderbird. I thought it was very cool. It would be a full 7 years until Honda would introduce its first car into Hawaii, and another year till they made it onto the West Coast. And that was a game changer in the auto industry. In 1962, music came on these and was played on these, unless you were lucky enough to have one of these babies, which opened into this, the vaunted KLH Model 11 stereo system designed by Henry Close. This was sophisticated home entertainment. It was quite a year for culture, with such beloved tunes as Stranger on the Shore, I Can't Stop Loving You, and the immortal Mashed Potato Time by Philadelphia's own Dee Dee Sharp, topping the charts. How many of these can you remember? I bet quite a few. I bet you can even sing them. In 1962, Desert Revolt also claimed the Oscar, in fact 7 of them, but surprisingly not for Best Actor, which went to, can you remember? This guy, Gregory Peck, in a movie about bird homicide based on a 1960 runaway bestseller. In fact, his character actually had a profound impact on more than a generation of lawyers and judges, and the book was a publishing phenomenon. 55 years later, everybody's hero, Scout's dad, Atticus Finch, would reveal a much darker and more ambiguous personality with a less than favorable opinion of poor Boo Radley and his kind when Harper Lee published her other book, her only other book, which actually she had written before. For the more sophisticated New York crowd and Brandeis wannabes, the best play that year was a cynical, booze-addled screamer by Edward Albee, featuring loud shouting, existential bitterness, and broken dreams. On Broadway, it starred Uta Hagen and Arthur Hill in roles made even more famous by Liz and Dick in Mike Nichols' 5 Oscar-winning movie 4 years later. The film actually was nominated for 13 Oscars, one of only 2 films ever nominated in every available category. All 4 actors were nominated, and Liz and Sandy Dennis actually won them. Rumor is that it was based on Edward Albee's time at Brandeis, of which I can find no record except for in 1983 when he chaired the committee choosing the school's Creative Arts Award, are happily false. Women were frequently glamorous ornaments to successful men in 1962, minding the home fires, playing canastas and mahjong, or cheerfully working as assistants and secretaries, or volunteering, but their lives had changed profoundly and irreversibly in 1960. Yeah, that's right. And we were only a few years away from the ferment and revolution which would set women on a very different path sexually, professionally, and politically. Men, we have to admit, sort of like them this way, and when they fantasize, well, let's just say that adult entertainment, too, was in a relatively innocent and underdeveloped analog mode. Hugh Hefner's relatively innocent and restrained little magazine, by today's standards, was hidden in millions of adolescent dresser drawers. After all, in those days, most work was done on these, and even very high-end computing still looked like this. And information was somehow stored on gazillions of these. Words like Fortran were popular in small circles. In 1962, both Steve Jobs and Bill Gates were only 7. And the word nerd had not yet entered the popular lexicon. In sports, really big, frightening football players, even on the champion Green Bay Packers, weighed in at maybe 260 pounds and smoked cigarettes. Mean old hard-drinking Sonny Liston, just a year or so out of the pen, pummeled sweet Floyd Patterson into boxing oblivion in 2 minutes and 5 seconds of round 1. The goddamn Yankees won their millionth or so World Series over the recently arrived San Francisco Giants, and decidedly became the first gray horse ever to win the Kentucky Derby. People barely knew anything about 1960 Olympic champ Cassius Clay, and he didn't know anything about Elijah Muhammad. Gatorade didn't even exist. But, on the positive side, anabolic steroids and athletes had already become much too friendly. In 1962, Johnny took over The Tonight Show, Walter took over the news, and the Cartwright family, can you name them all, as well as Wagon Train, led all TV ratings, with Gunsmoke, Hazel, and Perry Mason not very far behind. And finally, in 1962, we all graduated from high school. Our class was distinguished by a remarkable geographic diversity. 120, a bit more than 50% of us, amazingly, didn't even graduate from high schools in New York City, really. Some even came from schools upstate. Others traveled from places somewhere way out in the distant hinterlands of Saul Steinberg's drawing. Mike Moscovich and Carla Singer, for example, canoed in together from somewhere around here. It took them 4 months or so, and then Mike discovered that it actually snowed in New England, and he had left his skates back at home. As a result, he was depressed for the next 4 years. In 1962, I looked like this. There was lots of hair on the top of my head, and the rest of you guys were almost as adorable. That year, we all arrived here in Waltham to begin the greatest intellectual and social adventure of our young lives. That's Joy, soon to become Gila Landsman, being assisted by the president of the Student Council, Lou Serban. We all thought the upperclassmen were being nice and helpful. Actually, they were just scooping up all the cutest girls. And look there in the background. It's Sam Security, maintaining law and order. Freshman week, for me, brought a sweet personal invitation to tea at 66 Beaumont Avenue. How shocked I was to learn that the rest of you were invited too. I remember developing my first crush right there on that bus, and I ventured my first social success. I offered a nonchalant smile and hello to the brilliant and beautiful Ruth Needleman, who graciously smirked, looked out the window, and didn't talk to me for the rest of my Brandeis experience. So look at these. I recognize Peter Chuchka, Jeff Saltzman, Dave Roston, Kenny Kemper, I think, with the glasses. I bet you see some other people. Well, thank God we were soon ushered into the beautiful home of our gracious hosts, Abram Leon and Thelma Sacker. Actually, some of you know I grew up knowing Dr. and Mrs. Sacker. My folks, like some of yours, were Brandeis supporters, so every year or two he would drive down to our home in Western Massachusetts for dinner, where my folks would introduce him to the local Jewish movers and shakers, who inevitably would succumb to his eloquent charm as he made the case for supporting a Jewish Harvard, Yale, and Princeton all rolled into one. The 1950s and 60s, you may remember, Brandeis and Israel totally captivated the American Jewish imagination, as well as its pocketbooks. Looks like Dr. Sacker was somewhat less persuasive with the students. Notice the happy look on David Rosenfield's face, the droll irony in Janet Kaplan's eye. Sue Krause, as usual, was her cheerful self. And I bet you know the other women and men in this building. In this photo. I do. And what better time to meet the Avengers, 1966's version of the Bloods and the Crips. This was before they even knew they were the Avengers. Notice how Bob Safran is already browning up I. Milton with his unctuous, sophisticated New York charm. It's a skill that he's perfected in his career as a big-time New York real estate lawyer, browning up Robert Durst, for example. And I. Lloyd is already sporting his signature proto-marine trim that I think he still has today. Back on campus during those early days, it was a good time to meet new classmates and prepare for the coming intellectual onslaught. All these buildings are now gone. Well, it was soon time for Jessica Hurwitz and Ralph Berenbaum. These names just come to me, and the rest of us to register for classes and to be entertained/terrified by the stentorian and unforgettable commands of Mr. Charles Duhigg, the Grinch of Bernstein Marcus from 1955 to 1972. He died in 1978. I have to admit, I really liked him. I thought he was terribly funny and clever and smart. But today, I think students probably register, attend class, write their papers and exams, and find some action for Saturday night on their iPhones, all without leaving their rooms. I have no memory whatsoever of the mandatory school photo when we were there, but it's a nice opportunity to celebrate the beautiful and accomplished Judith Shapiro having hers taken before going on to even greater glory as an anthropology professor at Bryn Mawr, and then 14 years as president of Barnard. Today, she is actually the president of the Teagle Foundation, which is dedicated to support and strengthen liberal arts education. Some of us, and I suppose I mean me, secretly lusted for her in our hearts. Finally, there was a banquet of sorts as part of freshman week. I can't find the photo, but here are those pesky upper-class men again. serving special cuts, of course, to the girls in hopes they might succumb to their carnivorous charms. Notice the ever-cool Saha on the right performing his Ceylonese Salome trip on his tray. Can you name the rest of these guys? By the way, lest you think that I took all these pictures on my trusty Nickermat camera during our college days, I want to clarify that virtually every picture in this show was taken by the effervescent, genial, and greatly missed Ralph Norman, or his assistant, Betsy. Ralph was one of the most beloved characters on campus and became the official photographer in 1950 when there were only 107 students and 13 faculty members. I suspect few of you know that Ralph was also a boxer, a great bowler, and a skilled butcher before he became a photographer. That's why he loved grilling those steaks for the student at his barbecues, which he threw for the first graduates in 1952, and then got stuck with that gig forever. He documented all the formative years of Brandeis before he retired in 1981. He lost his vision in 1983, which is pretty ironic, when he was just 69, yet he continued to teach photography. He died in 1995. Ralph was a very special friend to me and to countless other Brandeis students, and he gave me all these negatives when I was doing my first reunion show, I think, in 1981. And Ralph captured all the campus highlights, didn't he, including the dances and kuts. Here's Rabbi Dean Leonard Zion cutting the rug with the missus. It looks like Henry Kissinger is looking jealously on. I must admit that, unlike the rest of you, I was pretty insecure at Brandeis and never felt all that comfortable at those dances. Perhaps it was the residual Ruth Needleman effect. Perhaps 5 years at an uptight, waspy boys' prep school. But look at that Southern charmer John Listman making his moves, or Alvin Stauber, another Southerner, searching for his dream girl. I recognize Ronnie Wanger and Don Florman and even Eric Sivan. And I thought the social scene of Brandeis was lousy. Maybe they're dancing to Mashed Potato Time or Johnny Angel or The Locomotion. Or maybe to some of those hot Eddie Condon or Ray Conniff numbers or a sultry Johnny Mathis ballad. My luck, I got to college just before the sexual revolution really got going. But of course some of you may have alternative theories to that. Goodness me, was this a prom of some sort? Can't believe it. No one invited me. Look at all those ties and jackets and full dresses. I think I see Mike Gundel. There's sultry Mary Huff making the moves on some helpless senior, and there's Rich Fertel and Norman Kolb. Recognize a lot of those faces? Have any idea what that welcome home thing is for? Who came home? Of course, only a few of us went to Brandeis for the social life and the dances, which, let's face it, was piss poor compared to the wild times we knew that were taking place on every other campus in America. But we were there for an education. I think we'd all agree that we got more than our money's worth, especially considering that tuition freshman year was $1,250. Brandeis had a great faculty, but sadly I have very few photos of them. Many truly inspired and illuminated my limited prep school educated mind in new directions, like Alan Grossman, who transformed the meaning of literature in ways that kept us all on edge and are still meaningful to me, and the handsome Heinz Lubash. I wish I had a picture of him. He amazed me in Social Science 1. I have no idea what happened to him. Here's Red Weisberg, Kermit Morrissey, and David Buxbaum, who taught me calculus so well I even took it twice. Alvin Lucier, the wild composer, and the courtly and thoughtful Dr. Nachum Glatzer, who was a graduate student of and then successor to Martin Buber at the University of Frankfurt before he escaped here. He was a kind and modest man of great accomplishment. And he used to always say, "We just don't know." Well, modest is not a word that anybody would use to describe Peter Diamandopoulos, who went on to fame, indeed notoriety and scandal at Adelphi University in Long Island. He epitomized what Alan Grossman introduced us to in the Iliad as the great sin of hubris. Of course, big crowds often gathered in Ford Hall to see faculty stars like Herbert Marcuse, who not only inspired his students, but also his confidant and secretary, the hilarious and wonderful Seda Gordon, sitting here in the front. Seda was one of the most delightful and witty characters on campus and a very special and favorite luncheon companion of mine. Well, Marcuse also influenced the incipient Phi Beta Kappa revolutionary Angela Davis, who just 5 years out of Brandeis became an alumna of the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list, an achievement that skipped our class completely, but reappeared with the class of 1971, with Susan Sachs and Kathy Power, who joined her even before they got their diplomas. Of course, we were at school to study and learn, but it was always good to have a cute study partner to do your preparation in bed, so getting to sleep would be a lot simpler, to spend time with Jack and Bert Goldfarb at their little library, or to meditate on upcoming exam questions, to listen to music, look, an LP, or just to take a snooze. Notice the university provided ashtrays, certainly another relic of the ancient past. Group study was popular too, especially among science nerds. I have no idea what's going on here, but it does remind us that in a pre-PC age, learning and studying were completely different activities. And I mean PC as in personal computer. With a computer in front of you, though, distraction has a totally new meaning, as the entire world of information is now accessible in so many ways, let alone the unbelievably more graphic replacements for those sock drawer Playboy magazines. Young people are amazed when I tell them that none of us ever locked our doors when we were in college. In fact, I don't ever remember having a key to my room. But then what did we really have to steal? Of course, dorm life had its lighter moments in those days. This may be where the expression climbing the walls comes from, or from a preview of Spider-Man. Slot racing cars were always fun, and here is my freshman year roommate, the notable future judge, A. Scott Penkower, one of the original masters of Forkwan, playing cards with the future SDS radical Bob Schwartz, with their books handy in case they had a sudden need for a study break. Bridge 2 was a popular distraction. Here are the Siamese Bobs playing with, I think, Janet Kaplan. The problem at Brandeis was it was very difficult to find a dummy. Maybe the fourth was Larry Grylack. It's amazing how these names have come back to me faster than those of people I met yesterday. I was fortunate to spend 2 years in the deeply intellectual confines of North A. In a pre-internet age, we found an original method of total information immersion and overload with this successful way of recycling old newspapers. Here, the victims were Eric Sivan and Mike Burland, who were such total slobs that they didn't even notice their room had been papered for 3 days. This was wholesome, good fun in the 1960s. Jews weren't big drinkers, and marijuana was 3 or 4 years in the future. Yes, those were the days when you could literally bury your friends in information. In this case, the organizing culprits were Bill Moody, David Cumming, and I'm pretty sure that other haircut belongs to Steve Stern, our second-floor Chicago-born opera impresario who regularly got his friends' gig as supernumeraries for the Metropolitan Opera's annual trip to Boston. Yes, that was a great night at the opera. There I am singing the triumphal march in the Met's traveling Aida, just in case you don't recognize me. Zirkin swears that he was there too and almost ruined the set with his spear, but I don't see him anywhere, and he's really not too reliable a source. Of course, life was far more civilized in the girls' dorms, when there actually were girls' dorms, where when not studying, schmoozing was the number one distraction, And the big event of the evening was when the Alan Zirkin's trusty sandwich girl would show up around 10 with her vast assortment of delicious gourmet subs. Those subs paid for Alan's senior year, and frankly, I still don't think that he has sufficiently thanked the hundreds of us who seriously risked our health to keep his tuition fully paid. And the primary alternative to schmoozing was, of course, schnoozing. Today this photo might have gotten Ralph arrested. Of course, the bigger deal for the girls was going out on a date. Here's a lovely Brandeis co-ed speaking on one of the 2 phones available on her entire floor to her date from BU or MIT or, God willing, Harvard, who's obviously late since he was probably calling from the only phone on his floor. She's getting moral support from her roommate, who obviously has less exciting plans for the evening. It's hard to explain this world to our kids who believe, in fact, that every child is born with his or her own smartphone tied to her hand and can be calling, emailing, messaging, or Facebooking the entire world on the drive across town. On my floor, only Johnny Revson had his own phone, and that was because he reputedly had a large and independent source of outdoor income. Ah, yes. Those were the days. Look at those cuties, and they've barely changed. Now, some of the following color shots actually come from Mary Huff, Mike Moscovich, and Mike Lederman. This is the meaning of snapshot. These certainly bring back some happy and tender memories. Phil Paul was my junior brother and turned into a great friend. And isn't that Richie Heimoff there with Barbara? And here's Rosalie and Emily bookless at the beach. And finally, Mark and Susan, who, if I remember correctly, got married in the middle of freshman week. How about some more from the Lederman collection? It's hard to recognize Winkelstern without his trademark turban, but this is from the days when he was still a Catholic and was still called Dick and thought teeth were for smiling and eating rather than a career path. And notice the picture on the left in the second row. Before they built the used-in campus center, there was a big unused reservoir. And one day, when I think I was reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment in the library's Leonardo da Vinci room, I heard a strange sound. It was the sound of a plane, and then I heard snapping of branches and a muffled crash. Does any of you remember that? Here's Ralph's photo of that dark, tragic event. An anthropology graduate student took a freshman girl up whom he had just met, and they were both killed that day. He was trying to impress his friends in the anthropology department. How sad. Many of our days were spent coping with the vagaries of New England weather. It was an era when the term global warming was yet to be coined, and winters were still pretty grueling. I recall some really big snowstorms that paralyzed the campus. It looks more like a scene from the Game of Thrones than a college campus, even though it now looks as if it were overrun by Goths. The original ones, not the Harvard Square crew. The castle is still the most popular address on campus. But this year, Brandeis announced that after 400 years, a major renovation to the castle is going to take place. And we saw some of the possibilities during the reunion. But having agents deep within the campus security, remember I was very close to Sam, I was lucky to secure one of the first artistic renderings of what it very well may look like. What do you think? Isn't that great? And speaking of the devil, here's our beloved campus cop on another secret mission to bum out some self-centered, vile parking transgressors. Damn, that car on the right looks like it's as old as Sam himself. Actually, Sam, like Ralph Norman, was one of my favorite campus characters. He was always genial and friendly, even when freely dispersing those parking tickets, and he had a great rapport with the students. In those early days of Brandeis, remember, the place was younger than any of us were. There was still a family environment on campus, and much of the staff had been there since the very beginning. Some had actually worked at Middlesex Medical School, which you may not know, failed to get accreditation from the AMA, many think because it accepted students only based on merit, hence had far too many minorities, if you get my drift. At a time when the AMA was still trying to restrict the production of physicians, and many Jewish aspirants looked to Europe and Mexico for their medical educations. Of course, not all employees embrace the family feeling. In my 3 years of eating in Kutz, I never once saw this woman smile. Here's living proof that even a nice little lay doesn't cheer up the chronically grumpy. Well, back to the weather and the hard winters. In that long ago pre-digital age, relief from the rigors of learning and studying often came in the epistolary form. See, that's a word that I learned in Alan Grossman's Humanities 1 class. In this case, I'm referring to the 11 o'clock opening of the mail room, where we each had our own totally unsecured boxes for collecting first class and campus communications. Can you imagine such a system today? Sense the excitement? The rush was on. Ah, yes, there's Chicago's own, the ever-effervescent, out-of-focus Melanie Rovner. I see Dave Roston again, and here's the lovely Gwen Carroll, who seems to be in a lot of these shots. Sadly, Gwen couldn't make it to the reunion. She fell off a bicycle and broke her arm a couple of weeks before it, and so she missed this. And looking at this, the name Melissa Trommer comes to mind. Does that seem right? And that could be Debbie Whitestone as well. Where? Oh, that's Melissa Trommer. The other ones, I got the arrows screwed up. Here's one of the Levin twins. My money's on Howard, but I doubt that either one could definitely identify this shot. And here's a line forming to mail stuff. Must have been Christmas time. And as we've seen, the mailroom also had a bulletin board for posting announcements. I definitely remember during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 a notice from the senior activist and possible paranoid Evan Stark soliciting an immediate lift to Tierra del Fuego. Honest to God. And in case you forgot where it was, it's there. Mike Moscovich reminded me that Professor Aberle, who during the crisis spoke out against the U.S. invasion of Cuba and expressed her hopes that the U.S. would actually lose any confrontation with the Soviets. She was promptly fired from Brandeis and exiled across the continent to distant Vancouver, where he also lives, and at 71 actually plays hockey twice a week in a wheelchair. And speaking of Evan Stark, I actually looked him up on Facebook. Here's part of his page highlighting his education. And here's the man himself, still pushing back against evil, like Sisyphus. And speaking of politics, what could be more political than the Brandeis Student Council? I'm still trying to figure out what exactly they did. I know that Steve Moore here on the top left looks quite a bit like President Obama. Peter Cyrus no longer smokes his pipe. Mike Oberman is definitely still wheeling and dealing in Chicago. And Frank Bloch is still married to Melissa. And he's just retired from teaching law at Vanderbilt. He's never come to a reunion, and he kept his perfect record this year as well. And whatever happened to Vic Hausner? I have no idea. Of course, an even more significant form of non-scholastic activity which brought Brandeis worldwide fame was its basketball teams. This was the team our first year when the Brooklyn phenom, Gary Goldberg, then minus the David, brought wild hopes of a return to hoop glory to campus. resembling that of the 50s when Brandeis actually played and won in Madison Square Garden. How many of these faces can you name? I must say that basketball our first year was really fun. Gary brought flash and pizzazz and a cocky confidence to the team, making great passes and some amazing shots. But all of a sudden, in the middle of sophomore year, if I remember properly, he was gone, and the team fell into a deep and extended slump. This, I think, is a team our sophomore year on which Stewie Paris was the captain, but which continued the team's downward slide. I noticed that Gary G. seems to have already departed the premises, replaced by the fleet-footed Mike Lederman and the long ball assassin Joe Perkins. They must have won a few games because they certainly seem to be celebrating something here, and I don't think it was law school acceptances. I think the next year, the second in the Irv Olin regime, the team achieved its last known perfect season. Not one victory, despite the presence of Steve Heller, Joltin' Joe Perkins, and Slashin' Santos Simino. The captain was Richie Heimoff. I've heard rumors that megawatt Mike Lederman, resenting his role as sixth or seventh man, began spiking the team's Gatorade with LSD. Remember, these are just rumors. That year, instead of looking a lot like this, our cheerleaders looked a lot more frequently like this. Why the varsity refused to scout the intramural leagues, where so much great raw talent was on display each week, is beyond me. Well, look at that shot of Peter Cyrus. There was a lot of tough competition on those courts. These were the odds when the men tried to take on Miss Judge in a light scrimmage. Actually, women's basketball fared much better than the men's team in our day. Here's the women's varsity in 1966, a year in which they whacked up a historic high in victories led by Judy Smith, Pat Rosenthal, and Lois Galgay. Don't believe me? Check out this article from the leader in sports journalism. If you want to read that, come back to it, or pause. Some people have speculated that the decline in Brandeis men's basketball might have been the responsibility of a subpar cheerleading squad. This raises the age-old existential question of whether Jewish girls can actually be effective cheerleaders. You know, they're supposed to be yentas and complainers. Despite the exception of Melanie, can they really be sufficiently perky and inspiring? Sadly, the evidence suggests perhaps not. They seemed intent and sensitive to the epic struggle on the court, while Santos actually sitting in his civvies along the side of them. And then thrilled when Brandeis put in 2 more points. Maybe the only 2 points, but with the team's mediocre record, it was clear that our cheerleaders needed a boost. So, in 1964, it came to them from a completely unexpected, unrequested, and unforgivable arrival of the very classy North A cross-dressing cheerleading team, who brought a new style of grace and perkiness to the cheerleading arena. 5 decades before the LGBTQ finally registered on a national consciousness, the North A cheerleaders were pioneers indeed. Perhaps this is the real reason that Gary Goldberg fled to the West Coast, even ahead of the civil rights and women's rights movements. Brandeis was a true pioneer in the cross-dressing revolution, which sadly never quite caught fire beyond Waltham, New York City, San Francisco, and Provincetown. You'd be surprised about how many opposing teams covertly hit on us, asking for a little action after the games. But it was North A pride as well as poor taste that gave our small band of warriors such misguided swagger and cohesion. I can still recognize some of these guys by the back of their heads. By the way, this is the only photograph in the world of that features both Alan Zirkin and the brilliant, much-lamented Rishon Bialer, who was killed in a tragic car crash during his first year of medical school. His loving classmates at Brandeis, led by Mike Oberman and Eli Siegel, established significant academic prizes in his honor both at Brandeis and at Harvard Medical School. Inspired by the piss-poor record of the school's basketball team, Aaron Miller and I collaborated with Dean Scan to start a lacrosse team in the spring of 1964. I mean, how much worse could we be? My thoughts were to assemble the leftover remnants of Benny Friedman's football program and start another contact sport. So despite the fact that only 3 of us had ever played the game before, we began, and we even had a few victories. The next year, we actually won a few more, and by the end of the season, the team achieved varsity status, despite Mike Moskovich occasionally having such severe hangovers on game days that he needed to wear sunglasses. What a role model. Before we became a varsity, we actually had to caravan in cars to our away games. Fortunately, Winkelstern and I had matching Triumph TR4 sports cars, so we made quite an impression arriving at our destinations. We saved dough by getting the extra small models. As you can see, these cars new cost $1,250. Unfortunately, our record on the field was, to say the least, a bit spotty, but we really had a great time. About 6 years later, however, the school removed the varsity status and the team once again became a club. Brandeis offered many terrific cultural diversions for those exhausted from watching the teams lose. There was the ever-popular Beat Bobby Fischer at chess nights when the 19-year-old reigning American champ took on 15 or 20 self-proclaimed experts simultaneously. 1 or 2 actually worked him to a draw. There were some wonderful campus plays, in this case one featuring Joel Dorfler, Mike Charles, Charlie Giuliano, and I think that actually starred Art Gibson, our classmate, who sadly was killed in a mountaineering accident sophomore year. There was the high-quality Brandeis chorus and classical concerts, in this case starring our very talented classmate Ellie Liebman. And there were dance performances. Did you know that Bob Aronson was actually a dancer? We had visits from great writers like James Baldwin and Allen Ginsberg. God, they look so young. Great folk music performers in the intimate Chumley's coffee house like Tom Paxton and Jim Kweskin and Doc Watson. And, of course, there were big concerts by the likes of Peter, Paul, and Mary. Mary, whose sister Ann Travers, you might remember, was a member of the class of '64. Then there were the greats, the jazz greats like Thelonious Monk, whom I had the weird honor, you might say, of peeing next to in the men's locker room restroom. Talk about your unlikely moment with greatness. And, of course, who could forget possibly the greatest concert of our college years, delivered by the top group in the nation, Diana Ross and the Supremes, Mary Wilson and Flo Ballard. What most of us forget is that the girls in the group were like our class, all born in 1943 and 1944. And here they were, touring the nation at the top of the charts while we were studying literature, history, and psychology. But they too came to Brandeis, and thanks in no small measure to Peter Cyrus, who was head of the Student Service Bureau, booked them, and then made the evening even more wildly bizarre by spontaneously inviting the entire sold-out gym audience over the PA system at the end of the concert to a party at Alan Zirkin's house in Waltham. Needless to say, Alan had no idea that he was having a party, and it took about 10 or 12 police cars to disperse the near riot on his street when 500 people showed up. Of course, we had more meaningful visits on campus from the likes of Dr. Martin Luther King, who inspired our classmate David Gelfand to become a civil rights activist and spend time in Mississippi. According to the internet, David has had a distinguished career as a molecular biologist. And then who could forget the electricity and, frankly, anxiety that filled Ford Hall the day that Malcolm X came to speak. It's hard to believe that such fear could be generated by a man in his mid-30s. Reading his autobiography gave me much more insight into him. Well, all of this led eventually to that crystal clear day in June. How do you like that for a segue? 1966, when for a short while at least it seemed that our graduation ceremonies might never even begin, because an outraged Dr. Sacker had all the leaflets explaining the silent protest planned against Ambassador Arthur Goldberg confiscated by the Waltham police. Future crisis mediation practitioner and professor and former sandwich distribution kingpin Alan Zirkin, who only graduated thanks to a major group paper writing effort, slightly illegitimate, in the Sherman Lounge just days before, represented our class in a tense, uncertain, and difficult negotiation. He'll be glad to explain it to you someday and sign autographs. Finally, facing angry parents and trustees, if the event did not proceed, a red-faced, flabbergasted Dr. Sacker relented. The pamphlets were once again distributed, and the commencement commenced. The world was soon aware that the students around the country cared deeply about what was happening on the other side of the globe because, according to the Boston Globe, valedictorian, this is a quote, Stephen P. Raskin, gave the Brandeis administration a roasting in his remarks to an audience of 4,000. His classmates stood to applaud him. But how reliable is the press? According to this article, there were only 150 of us there that day. Sadly, Steve didn't make it to our reunion either. However many that there were, soon after that, we all graduated and moved into the ranks of grateful and now almost elderly alumni. I don't know about you, but I've cherished my connection with our wonderful school and with all of you, with whom I experienced such a rich and stimulating and memorable time. Our 4 years together have somehow now turned to 54, and I'll always feel that our years at Brandeis have become an indelible part of my life that I'll always treasure. That is, if I can still remember them in the years to come.